Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to do a kind of response to a video that James Griffiths just made on 10 albums that were hell to make. So I enjoyed watching his video, and I thought, well, there's a few I can think of, and then I had a go and I could actually think of 10. So I'm going to go through those, and I'm not going to repeat anything James said. So the first thing to say is maybe I'm exaggerating when I say hell to make, but I would say it's definitely the case that there was tension in the air for reasons which I'll explain as we go through the top 10. So maybe not hell, maybe that's a little too strong language. So in no particular order, I'm going to start off with Famous Last Words from Supertramp, 1982, the long-awaited follow-up to Breakfast in America, Roger Hodgson's last album with the band, and him and Rick were kind of moving in different directions, and Roger Hodgson has retrospectively said that he regrets making this album. It was a last-ditch attempt to see if there was any magic there in a band which had kind of run its course. But, you know, I'm a bit keener on this album than Roger is. There's still some good moments on it, and I'm glad it's a Supertramp album versus solo albums. So we got the bona fide classic It's Raining Again is on that album, and also some nice tracks like Know Who You Are and My Kind of Lady. So it's not a write-off, but it was a tense one to make. And Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies were living in different parts of California. I think Roger was living out of town and Rick was kind of in town, and they couldn't agree where to record the album. So a lot of Roger's parts were laid down near where he lives, and then a lot of Rick's parts unfortunately were laid down in the city, and maybe they weren't all in the studio at the same time, so that kind of scenario. But as I say, still some good musicianship, not on the same level as their 4 previous albums, but not too bad. Hearts and Bones is my next choice from Paul Simon, 1983, and the reason I've chosen this is because it started off, I'll just tell you the history. So in 1981, Simon and Garfunkel did a sort of comeback concert in Central Park, September, and it was a great success. And so on the back of that, they decided to maybe do a couple more concerts and maybe record an album. So they went in the studio together and they laid down a few tracks which would eventually turn up on Hearts and Bones, and Garfunkel supplied vocals. And then sort of halfway through, Paul Simon said, these songs are too personal. So he literally wiped Garfunkel's voice off the tapes, and it emerged as a solo album. It didn't do very well commercially, but it's quite a big fan favourite. Garfunkel was furious, and they didn't speak for years and years, although they did do concerts together quite a few years later. They never made a Simon and Garfunkel album. So that was the tension behind Hearts and Bones. The next one I'm going to choose is the Madcap Laughs from Syd Barrett. Now, this album had Roger Waters and Dave Gilmour both trying to help out their former bandmate, but he was in pretty rough shape by this time, and he was turning up to the studio kind of not consistently, and whenever he felt like it, and even when he did turn up, he'd disappear for an hour and then come back, and very difficult to actually record an album when you've got the lead singer not on the top of his game physically, should we say, although the songs are pretty memorable on this album and on the following album, Barrett. But that was it. He recorded those 2 albums and then disappeared into obscurity. So I just thought I'd mention that. They had a hard time trying to get an album out of him. They succeeded. As I say, it's a pretty decent album, but it was a tough one to make by all accounts. Number 4, we've got Dirty Work from the Rolling Stones, 1986, with their horrible mid-80s cover, unless you like that kind of thing, with those multicoloured jackets and trousers. Mick and Keith were not getting on at all at this stage, so Mick had just embarked on a solo career, much to Keith's annoyment, and that was She's the Boss. And then at Live Aid, if you remember, Bob Dylan appeared with Ronnie Wood and Keith Richards backing him on guitar, and Mick appeared solo, or with David Bowie actually. So the seeds were already sown for the bust-up, which kind of occurred straight after this album was released, really, and then Talk Is Cheap came out from Keith with a dig at Mick, and relations didn't improve until '89. But this album from '86 is, I mean, they laid down some reasonably good tracks. Well, on occasion it's very uneven as an album, but I would say the highlights would be the song Fight and the title track Dirty Work. There's a track called One Hit to the Body which starts off promisingly, but then it sort of gets a bit tedious. And if you watch the video to that, sort of Keith has been quite aggressive with his guitar playing and kind of almost using it like a weapon, like he wants to knock Mick's head off. It's quite funny to watch. So that was not an easy album to make, and apparently Charlie was struggling with substance abuse at the time, so that's the reason they didn't tour for that album. So another famous example of an album which was so much hell to make, but so we say challenging, would be Rumours from Fleetwood Mac. So just before this album was started, they had multiple bust-ups romantically within the band. So Buckingham and Nicks were an item and they no longer were, and Christine McVie was married to John McVie, the bass player, and they split up. And Christine McVie started seeing the lighting engineer. So, you know, you'd have scenarios where they didn't want to be in the studio at the same time, or if someone walked in the room, the other one would walk out, or if the lighting engineer turned up, maybe words would be exchanged or whatever. All very tense. I think Mick Fleetwood's marriage was also on the rocks at this stage or shortly after that. A lot of drugs being taken, but, you know, the proof's in the pudding. They came up trumps with a great album, as we all know, but not an easy one to make, presumably, just because of the personal problems between the band members. Number 6, we're going to go with Season of Glass from Yoko Ono. So this came out in June of '81, 5 or 6 months after John died, and it must have been very hard for her to go back into the studio with the same musicians she recorded Double Fantasy with. Tony Levin, Andy Newmark, Earl Slick, Hugh McCracken, George Small, Arthur Jenkins, and just lay down these really sad tracks mourning the passing of her husband. And there's many a sad track and many a beautiful track on this album. Goodbye Sadness, Dogtown, which was an earlier track, resurrected actually. Nobody Sees Me Like You Do is a particular standout. And Silver Horse, which was originally a double fantasy, intended for double fantasy. So a great album, her best in my opinion, but very tough to make in the circumstances following John's murder. Number 7, we're going to go with ABBA's final album, The Visitors. I know that they were fairly professional and sort of kept themselves going, even though the couples both had split up by this time. Agneta and Bjorn split up in the summer of 1980, and Annie Frieda and Benny announced that they'd split up towards the start of '81. So when this album was being recorded, there must have been some tension in the air. I don't suppose it was complete hell, because they did manage to stay friends more or less over the years, and of course they've made a comeback recently, but I guess this was not an easy album to make, and I think they're on record as saying that they were getting a bit tired of working with each other, and this was their last album for 40 years. So they split up shortly after this and made a couple of singles. So next album I don't even have to show you, because it doesn't exist really, although they have tried releasing it in various forms over the years. This is the Smile album from the Beach Boys, so the long-awaited follow-up to Pet Sounds, which was going to contain Heroes and Villains and Good Vibrations, but it kind of, Brian got nervous and thought the public are going to hate it, and the other band members may not have been too keen on the direction he was going, and he just shelved the whole project. And a couple of tracks turned up on subsequent albums like Cabinescence and Surf's Up, and then just recently there's a whole album of the Smile sessions with kind of outtakes and demos and stuff, but it's never really, and Brian did a live version of the concert not so long ago, and but at the time in '67 Brian was so nervous about the whole project, he released this kind of hodgepodge of nothing really called Smiley Smile, which was, I think it did contain Heroes and Villains, but it didn't really contain hardly any of the other tracks from Smile, and so it was a big letdown. It's not a great album at all. And so we have this, for years and years, it's been sort of thought of as the lost album, the album that never was. And maybe if it had come out in 67, 68, it wouldn't be as great as everyone's talking about. One never really knows. But there were certainly some great tracks on there which didn't get released for years. Number 9, we're going to go with Rock and Roll from Lennon. And this was a bit of a mixed bag. The New York sessions in 74 went quite smoothly, but this album started in Los Angeles in the fall of 73, autumn of 73, and the sessions were legendary in their madness, and the number of people who turned up just to have a party as well as play along. So Phil Spector was producing, so he encouraged 10 guitars and 10 bass players. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. And there was a lot of liquor in the studio, and Phil even fired a gun on more than one occasion, I think. And Lennon was pretty much drunk throughout the session, but he did manage to capture a few songs from those Spector sessions which survived onto the album, such as Just Because, which is brilliant, and Boney Maroney, which is another highlight. You Can't Catch Me is also from the Spector sessions, and Sweet Little 16 is as well, and Angel Baby, which got left out the album, is from the Spector session. So it wasn't a write-off in terms of what came out of it, but to make, it was pretty much hell, and Spector disappeared with the tape for months on end, and Lennon tracked him down, found him, and then decided to finish off the album in New York. And so we have this kind of, it doesn't flow too well as an album because you've got two producers. But anyway, it turned out to be quite a decent effort. Now, for number 10, we're going to go back nearly 130 years to 1896 and Gilbert and Sullivan's final operetta. It's not really an album, but I do have it on CD, so I'm counting it as an album. So this was their final effort together. Having had the big row after the Gondoliers over the cost of a carpet at the Savoy Theatre, and they fell out and came back together in 1893 to do Utopia Limited, and then grudgingly came back together to do this one, The Grand Duke. And apparently they were not getting on well, and soon after it was finished, Sullivan retreated to his holiday home in the south of France and said, "I've just ordered some more straw from my hair. Gilbert was driving me mad." So they were not in tune with each other as they had been for so much of their career, which is a shame. But there's some good music on here. In particular, the lyrics and the dialogue is a bit redundant, as people have said. But there's some good stuff on here, and I wouldn't be without it. But unfortunately, the two collaborators didn't speak with one another before Sullivan died in 1900, although they had exchanged reconciliatory letters just before Sullivan died, and I'm happy to report. So it's a bit of a sad end to a great partnership, but that was The Grand Duke from Gilbert and Sullivan. And so here we have 10 more albums, which were hell or hellish to make. Hope you enjoyed that. And I'm sure there's many more, which are not in my collection. I've just stuck to the ones I know. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.